Good afternoon. I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome so many people here for today's special event. Many of you know that the Baker Institute has multiple missions. We have resident research fellows who conduct projects on subjects as diverse as energy security, health policy, religion, tax policy, many other programs that I think are programs we're very proud of. We also are dedicated to the educational mission of the university in many ways, but in particular through the number of excellent courses which our fellows give to our undergraduates. We're involved in conflict resolution, especially through the work of Ambassador Dirigian, who would be here today, except he's out of town, who's our founding director and who runs a Track 2 exercise with Palestinians and Israelis looking for solutions to their common problems. And we do something else here. We invite to this podium diplomats, scholars, public officials, journalists who bring the world of public policy to Rice University. If you look at the wall outside our building, you'll see our motto: a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action. And our speaker today does precisely that. He is, of course, Robert Reich, who was one of the most influential secretaries of labor in recent American history, a professor who's written, by my count, 14 books, a feat which I can hardly believe, and I think it's fair to say one of the leading public intellectuals in the United States. We're very pleased to have you here, Professor Reich. There are a number of sponsors to this event, not only the Baker Institute, but the Brazos Bookstore, the School of Social Sciences of Rice University, the Department of Economics at the University of Houston, and Barbara Ann Radnofsky, who is not here today in her capacity as a candidate for the position of Attorney General, but as a supporter of this event, and we welcome you in that capacity. What's going to happen here today is that Professor Chin-Hui Zhang from the University of Houston will more formally introduce Professor Reich. He will then talk on the subject Aftershock, the next economy and America's future, and then Ms. Radnofsky will handle the question and answer session. Chin-Hui Zhang is a chaired professor at the University of Houston, an economist who's also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And her specialty is labor markets, and she's particularly interested in disparities, especially racial and gender disparity. Most of her work is related to United States. She also does work in Africa. We are very glad to welcome you to the Baker Institute today and to the podium. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. You'll be happy to know that I'm not going to be here standing here talking about my own research, but I'm going to go right to my agenda, which is to introduce this evening's speaker, Robert Reich. Robert Reich is the professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He has also previously taught at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, as well as Brandeis University. He received his undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College, graduated summa cum laude, and then promptly won a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford. And then after the fact, he went on to get a JD from the Yale Law School. So his public service, he has served under 3 national administrations, and most notably, of course, we know him as the Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. And during that time, he oversaw the passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act, increasing the minimum wage, welfare reform, and passage of various job training programs. So just as an aside, as a labor economist, that was actually kind of a heyday for us in terms of really qualified economists working in the Department of Labor under somebody who really understood labor policy. So that was an exciting time. In 2008, Time magazine actually named him one of the 10 most successful cabinet members of the century. So he has written no less than 14 books, and through his writing, he has continued a discourse and a dialogue with the public on issues that are particularly pertaining to American worker and the American middle class. And so I'm sure we're going to get to hear a lot more about those issues. So one of his books, The Work of Nations, has been translated into 22 languages. And I guess I just wanted to quote the opening paragraph from that book, because I think that is so prescient and so forward-looking in terms of what is to come. So this is what he wrote in 1991, so that's nearly 20 years ago. So I'm quoting, there will no longer be national economies, at least as we have come to understand that concept. All that will remain rooted within national borders are the people who comprise a nation. Each nation's primary assets will be its citizens' skills and insights. Each nation's primary political task will be to cope with the centrifugal forces of the global economy, which tear at the ties binding citizens together, bestowing ever greater wealth on the most skilled, while consigning the less skilled to a declining standard of living. So, in my opinion, these words are as relevant today as they were 20 years ago, and in fact, it has really taken on a sense of great urgency. So, I present Robert Reich.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jun, and thank you all for coming today, this evening, this afternoon. First of all, I want to start out with good news, because I think people these days need good news when it comes to the economy. You may have heard this already, but in case you haven't, roughly 2 weeks ago, 8 economists who are tasked with the job of looking at the business cycle, National Bureau of Economic Research, they discovered that the Great Recession has ended. Actually, not only that, it's even better. It ended a year ago, June. You feel better? It doesn't really feel much different, does it? I mean, that technical reading simply means that the contraction of the economy that marked the beginning of that Great Recession ended, and so technically we are in a recovery starting in June of 2009, because starting in June of 2009 the economy began to grow again, but it's been growing so slowly that it doesn't feel as if we've come out of the recession. In fact, I know a lot of people around the country, and I conduct, as I did when I was Labor Secretary, kind of a free-floating focus group. And many people say to me, not only does it not feel like we're out of the Great Recession, but whenever I hear somebody talk about the possibility of going into a double dip, I don't know what they mean, because I'm still in the first dip. I'm still dipping. I'm in a one long big dipper, long dipper. The Great Recession really has distinguished itself, shall we say, as something that is very different from recessions in recent memory. Something fundamentally has happened. It mowed down huge numbers of jobs. It took away savings. It took away homes. It has had a devastating effect on the economy, and also has had a very profound effect, and I will talk about this, on our society. Before the Great Recession, I personally was 5'10". Just to give you some indication. No, it really is not a joking matter. Maybe the best place to begin is to talk about why it happened now. We know more than we did before, and also to forecast where we are going. I want to take about 30 minutes to do all of that and talk a little bit about politics as well, because you see, you can't really separate politics from economics. In the 19th century, the whole field was called political economy. There was no separate field of economics until the great economist Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics in 1890. And then before that, in the 18th century, there was not even a field of political economy. It was all called moral philosophy. Adam Smith called himself a moral philosopher because, again, you could not separate politics and economics and ethics and fundamental questions about what a good society constituted or what constituted a good society. The proximate cause of the Great Recession we understand, and that is Wall Street and some excesses on Wall Street, and there's been a lot of writing, a lot of discussion about that. But if you peel away that first layer of the onion and you ask yourself, well, what really lay underneath the excesses of Wall Street? What you find is an explanation that goes something like this. In fact, maybe I can recreate the dialogue that I was engaged in with Paul Volcker about this. Paul Volcker, by the way, and I and a small group of economists and advisors and policy analysts were advising Barack Obama up until the point where he became officially the president, sworn in as president. And right after he won the election in November of 2008, we got together to try to talk about the economy and what had happened and what we were facing. And Paul Volcker, who is very tall, I mean, he really is indecently tall. Paul Volcker said, Mr. President, the reason we have got into trouble, if beyond Wall Street, I mean, the deeper reason is because Americans have spent beyond their means. Now, I understood this philosophy and this approach. I didn't disagree. It is true, just as it's true that Wall Street sort of went a little bit berserk. But if you peel the onion one layer more and ask yourself, why was it that Americans spent beyond their means, you get a more interesting, and I think slightly, with no disrespect to Paul Volcker, a slightly more sophisticated set of issues. And indeed, at that meeting, I wish I had said it, but my colleague, my former colleague from the Clinton administration, who was Council of Economic Advisors chair, Laura Tyson, piped up and she said, Paul, I disagree with you. It was not that Americans spent beyond their means, it was that their means had not kept up with what the growing economy should have been able to provide. And Laura was in a way, expressing exactly what I was thinking and the conclusion I had come to after years of both being in government but also being a student of what was going on in the economy and advising many businesses and advising an awful lot of people who needed to understand a deeper essence of what was going on. Let me give you an example. In 2007, the typical male worker in the United States was earning, if you adjust for inflation, now it's tricky, the adjusting for inflation is always tricky, but bear with me, the typical male worker in 2007 was earning just about as much, no more, than the typical male worker was earning 30 years before. Now that's quite remarkable when you think about it, because the American economy grew considerably over that 30-year period. How can it be that that male in 2007, this is before the Great Recession, was earning just about the same, adjusted for inflation, as the male worker, the typical male worker, that is the median male worker, smack in the middle, was earning 30 years before. More interestingly, or at least just as paradoxically, over that same 30-year period, the typical American family was able to keep on spending and maintain a standard of living reflecting a growing economy, even though male wages had flattened. So what's the explanation? And as I began to research and as I investigated, and it was not something, it's really for years, I've been thinking about this and worrying about this, it turns out that there are, or have been, 3 coping mechanisms. I call them coping mechanisms because they're ways in which American families coped with the stagnation of the median wage for men. Coping mechanism number 1, starting in the late 70s and continuing to an even greater degree in the 80s and 90s, was women going into paid work. Now, I wish I could tell you that the reason so many women streamed into the paid workforce beginning in the late 70s was because of all these wonderful professional opportunities open to women. But that's not the major reason. The major reason that women streamed into the paid workforce beginning in the late 70s was to prop up family incomes in which median male wages had stagnated, or in some senses, many cases actually declined. Just to give you a sense of that change, that coping mechanism number 1, if you look in the 1960s and early 1970s and see the percentage of women with young children in a workforce, it rarely exceeded 20%. By the 1990s, the percentage of women with young children who were in the U.S. workforce was over 60%. That's a huge social change. Not just an economic change, it's a dramatic change in the family, in the organization of production, in the way we think about who should be doing what in our society. It had and still has profound social consequences. But there was a limit to how many women and what percentage of women with young children could go into paid work. We reached that limit somewhere around the mid-90s, and at that time, Americans went and sought a second coping mechanism. Coping mechanism number 2 was everybody works longer hours. By the mid-1990s, and I remember when I was Secretary of Labor, going over the numbers with people in the Bureau of Labor Statistics because I found it very surprising. By the mid-1990s, that recovery, the typical American worker was putting in 350 hours a year more than the typical European worker, more hours even than the enormously industrious Japanese worker. We worked so hard, and this is we're talking about professionals as well as blue-collar workers, right through. In fact, many families had 2 wage earners and young children. And how did they put in 50, 60, 70 hours, sometimes on 2 jobs? They did it on shifts. I used to have a demographic term for these kinds of families. I called them DINS, D-I-N-S. Double income, no sex. And then we come to coping mechanism number 3. I mean, obviously, there's a limit to how many hours people can put in as well, right? And so we've exhausted coping mechanism number 1. And we've exhausted coping mechanism number 2. Coping mechanism number 3, and we saw most of it in this decade, this past decade, is for families to go deeper and deeper into debt, using their homes and the increasing value of their homes as collateral. So the debt didn't seem all that difficult. Refinancing their homes or getting home equity loans. Between 2002 and 2007, American families took out of their homes approximately, if you totaled it up, $2.3 trillion. And this enabled them to keep spending. In fact, all of these coping mechanisms, and I want to stress to you, all these 3 coping mechanisms allowed the great American middle class, however you define it, roughly, let's say, from $30,000 a year through $80,000 or $90,000 a year, it allowed that great American middle class to keep on spending enough to keep the economy going at or near full employment, apart from the obvious and necessary recessions that we went through. But generally speaking, the economy did well, Americans did well, standard of living went up, there was a lot of spending and a lot of jobs. The Clinton administration, of which I was proud to be a member, presided over an economy that created 22 million net new jobs. We had never seen a job creation system like that, but again, think of those three coping mechanisms, particularly starting in 1999, 2000, 2001, coping mechanism number 3, debt. And what happened eventually, we all know that housing bubble burst. That debt bubble could not continue to go on. Now, viewed this way, there has to be a question that arises in your minds, because it certainly did in mine. What happened? I mean, why didn't the typical middle-class family earn more? I mean, if you compare the period that I just talked about, 77 or 78 through 2007, to the earlier 30-year period, from the Second World War to 1977, there's a big difference. That earlier 30-year period featured dramatic increases in the median wage and reductions in inequality. People in the bottom 20% actually grew in terms of their incomes faster than people at the top. There was a lot of mobility, class mobility. I mean, a lot of things were going on. It wasn't a perfect age. I mean, I don't know how many of you watch Mad Men. Many of you, like me, lived through that era. It was not a perfect age. We had, I mean, blacks and women were relegated to second-class citizenship, but we worked hard as a society. The Great Generation, the greatest generation, came back from the war. We had a baby boom. Why was it that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and I were all born in 1946? Cher was also born in 1946. Why? Why is it anybody who's anybody was born in 1946? Because it's not complicated demographically, because my father was in World War II, and he came home to my mother. This is not complicated science. And there was a period of great prosperity. What happened? Why did we go from rising median wages to flat median wages? Why did we go from an economy that was growing to an economy that was continued to grow, but grew in a very different way? I started asking myself this question, and I came across the writings of somebody that some of you will may remember, maybe you've heard of, even if you don't remember him, and I'm going to ask you for a show of hands. And be careful, because I may call on you if you say that you remembered him or you know who he is. A fellow named Mariner Eccles. Yes? Who was he? Yes, well, you're almost right. Almost right. Treasury Department is very close. Not exactly right. Oh, no, actually, he started off 6 months. He was in the Treasury Department. He was. You're absolutely right. You get an A. Mariner Eccles, well, I'll give you a big hint. Because if you go to the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, right on Constitution Avenue, you know, it's a big, I don't know how many of you have been there. It's a big white, long building. It looks like a mausoleum. Very few windows. I used to go and have breakfast there with Alan Greenspan occasionally, and it was a kind of depressing place. But that building is called the Eccles Building. It's called the Mariner Eccles Building. The building is named after Mariner Eccles. So that should give you a hint. He was when he finished his 6 months at the Treasury Department, he then was appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt as chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and he was the Fed chair from 1934 to 1948. Now that's a long period of time. And he presided over the building of the monetary policy of the United States and a lot of the fiscal policies of the Roosevelt and then the Truman administrations. But Mariner Eccles is probably best known. He's a very interesting character. I don't want to go off on a tangent. I just want to give you a couple of facts about him, because he's a very colorful and interesting. By the age of 21, he was a multimillionaire. He was one of 21 children. from a big Mormon family. His father was from Glasgow, Scotland. He was one of the wealthiest men by the time he was 30 west of the Rocky Mountains. Had a huge chain of banks and also industries. He was an extraordinary industrialist. And when the Great Crash occurred in 1929, he was absolutely taken aback. His businesses were sufficiently diversified that he didn't go under. But he was just struck dumb, as were many others, by what had happened. He couldn't explain it. He thought that it was a typical downturn or maybe a deep downturn in the business cycle and assumed that by 1930, 31, 32, everything would be back to where it was before, but it wasn't back to where it was before. And by 1932, he had a kind of crisis of confidence. He had a change of heart. Everything he thought he knew about the United States economy, he felt suddenly was wrong. You might call it an Alan Greenspan moment. And he began looking differently at the economy, and he began seeing things slightly differently. When it came to understanding the cause of the Great Depression, he wrote a very interesting memoir, which I came across completely by accident. Nobody knows about it, as far as I could tell. I took it out of the library, and I was the only one who had taken it out of the library in 20 years or 30 years. But in that memoir, and I commend it to you, he talks about the cause of the Great Depression. He said, what happened in the 1920s, indeed in the 20 years, including the 1910s, leading up to the Great Crash, was the following. Technologies of industrialization, mass production, huge economies of scale. Think of Henry Ford. Enabled the economy to grow very rapidly and huge productivity improvements to occur. And that was all good. But the ownership of the structure of the industry was very narrow. Most of the profits, most of the benefits went to a smaller and smaller group of people. So that the great bulk of Americans, the middle class, the vast working class, could only keep their purchases up if they went into debt. And they went deeper and deeper into debt. And meanwhile, people at the very top, the industrialists, they invested in a fairly limited number of assets. They had a lot of money they didn't know what to do with. They put some in their businesses, but they didn't put very much after a point because, again, they worried that there was not going to be enough of a market for them by 1928. They speculated in land, in real estate, they speculated in commodities, and they speculated in the stock market. And that speculative boom and bubble, just as the debt bubble, eventually burst. And it burst in 1929. Now, when I read this by Mariner Eccles, I began thinking to myself, this is a part of the puzzle that I've been looking for. I didn't understand something, because I was trying to figure out why did median wages for those 30 years I mentioned before, from 1977 to 2007, why were they flat? Why did the economy continue to grow? What propelled that middle class ability to spend? Well, I understood those three coping mechanisms, but then where did all the money go? And just about then, I read Mariner Eccles, and I came across research by a group of economists who looked at tax returns. Tax returns providing a much more subtle set of data about really who was earning what. And here's what those economists found. That in the start of this 30-year period, that is the most recent 30-year period, where median wages flattened, at the start of that, in 1977, 1978, the top 1% of Americans by income were getting about 9% of total national income. Now, it's late in the afternoon, and I'm reading your eyes, and I know that when I say numbers, like any group of people in the afternoon, your eyes start to glaze over. So I'm going to say it again, because it's important. By the late 70s, the top 1% of Americans by income were getting about 9% of total national income. And then in the 1980s and 90s, the top 1% were getting more and more. Not because they were bad people, not because they was doing anything wrong. I'll get to why in a moment. But by 2007, the top 1% were getting 23.5% of national income. This is before taxes, this is before transfers, this is just in terms of what they were getting. Now here's the interesting thing. There was only one other year in the 20th century, or over the last 100 years, where the top 1% were also got 23.5 or more percent of national income. In other words, there was one other year of peak concentration of income, besides 2007. And that other year was, anybody want to take a guess? 1928. Now, I began thinking that maybe there's a relationship between the Great Recession, the Great Depression, and concentration of income. Maybe Mariner Eccles, the chairman of the Fed, one of the richest men in America before the Great Recession, certainly west of the Rocky Mountains, maybe he was onto something that helps us explain what happened more recently. Now, I am a student of technology as well as economic policy, and I know, because I've written about it, I've studied it, that in the mid or late 70s, you had a lot of new technologies coming on stream. Satellite communication technologies, cargo ships, containers. Eventually, in the 80s and 90s, the computer, and eventually the internet. All of these technologies allowed the production process to be parceled out around the globe, wherever things could be done most cheaply and at highest value. In other words, this term we use, one of the great terms in American discourse to have gone directly from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence, is globalization. Globalization. And indeed, there was an extraordinary globalization because of those technologies. So if you were very skilled, if you were well educated, if you were well connected, if you were involved in certain professions where that global economy was generating greater and greater demand for you, and the technologies that went along with it, you could do very well. But if you were not well educated, if you were doing routine work over and over again, that globalization process was going to work against you. The median male worker, particularly factory worker, was not going to get a great deal of positive response out of globalization or technological change, which is the second thing that happened in the late 70s. Remember, we used to have a lot of telephone operators and bank tellers and service station attendants. Well, we don't anymore. I tell my students, they don't believe me, that in order to make a deposit in a bank or get money out of a bank, I remember a time when you had to actually deal with a person. They say, no, a person? To make a long-distance call, you had to talk to somebody? It was the change. How many of you remember? Well, of course, you remember where there were service station attendants, but how many of you remember when service station attendants came out to your car in uniform? Anybody? This is a very old group of people. Well, I mean, I remember before I went to Washington, and by the way, my first job in Washington was with the Ford administration. I worked for Robert Bork. And I remember before I went down to Washington, there was a service station, and they did have, some of them had uniforms. The uniforms were just going out of service. But people, when taking your car down, there was a discussion. You'd actually talk to somebody. Somebody came out, do you want to, and they would ask you questions, and you'd give them answers, and sometimes they'd smile. And sometimes, they might even know about your family. It was a nice little social interaction. I came back from the Bill Clinton administration got in my car, went down to the gas station, the corner service station, and there was nobody there. I mean, it was dead. I was isolated. I was alone. It was just me and technology. Nobody was there. By the way, you know that you are no longer in the cabinet when you get in the back seat of your car and there's nobody in the front seat. It's a dead giveaway. I came back from Washington. I used to sit in the driveway, for several minutes, just in the back seat, and nothing happened. I had to relearn responsibility. But anyway, so the question for you, the point I want to make is that it's not just globalization, because all of those jobs I just mentioned, and many, many others like them, disappeared because of automation. And they were domestic jobs. They were not replaced by foreign workers. They were domestic jobs that were replaced by technology and automation. But here's something that a lot of people don't focus on, because as I go around the country, many people say to me, well, isn't the answer just to get manufacturing back? And I have to tell them with some sadness that I have been in the most modern manufacturing facilities in this country and around the world. I've been to facilities that are the future of manufacturing, and you go in those manufacturing facilities, there are not the old assembly lines with a lot of people. Actually, you go into these new factories and you have a few technicians who are sitting behind computer consoles, and those consoles are linked to numerically controlled machine tools and robotics, but technology has taken away a lot, if not most, of those old assembly line jobs. Technology is not the enemy, any more than globalization is the enemy. The point I want to make with you is that it has driven a wedge in the workforce between those with a lot of education, the right connections, who know how to solve complex problems, and on the other hand, where is everybody else? Well, they're not necessarily out of work. I mean, up until 2007, 2008, most of them had jobs, but they were in the local service sector of the economy, where you didn't have to know a huge amount that was technically complicated. You were in retail, or restaurants, or hotel services, or hospital services, hospital orderlies, child care, elder care. I don't mean to denigrate any of these jobs. They are all important jobs, but they don't have much money attached to them. The answer to the puzzle of what happened to the median wage for men is that the routine job that men used to do, often unionized, that routine job either went over there, that is abroad, or it succumbed to software. Over there or software. This is not a matter of blaming anybody. This is not a blame game. A lot of people are trying to blame people. This is not a blame game. This is simply the fact. And the question then becomes, and it's a very important and interesting question now, because what do we do now? We are stuck in the after effect, the aftershock. I call it the aftershock of the Great Recession. It's an aftershock in the sense that we don't have enough what economists call aggregate demand, that is purchasing power in the economy, in the vast middle class and working class of America. We don't have enough purchasing power to get the economy going back again, because all the coping mechanisms I mentioned before are gone, and now the middle class has got to address and face the fact that these routine jobs don't pay very much, the ones that are available, and most of the new jobs, most of the jobs that are there, to the extent that they are there, are in the local service sector of the economy. They don't pay very much, and therefore there's not enough demand, there's not enough money in people's pockets. They can't use their homes as ATMs anymore. There's not enough money in most people's pockets to keep the economy going, to get us out of the gravitational pull of the Great Recession. That is the fundamental problem. It is not an ideological problem. It's not a matter of left or right or center. We can debate what's the best response to this, but this is the reality. Now, in thinking about the response, it seems to me that not only do we have to think seriously about investment in education and infrastructure and all things that, as Dr. Jun pointed out, I've been talking about, as other people have been talking about for 20 years at least, but we also have got to face another troubling or perplexing reality. And this is very hard for us, and I'm going to say it as gingerly as I possibly can. Because when I talk about this, people get very uncomfortable. So are you ready? Put on your seatbelts. I'm not going to talk much. This is just going to be maybe 2 minutes, and then we can forget it. All right? I mean, I often don't talk about this in polite, mixed company, but I'm going to have to talk about it. And I never talk about this in Texas, but I'm going to. No, that's not true. That is not. See, the thing is, some of you I know are Republicans, and I want you to know that I respect you. I don't like you, but I respect you. No, that's not true at all. I like and respect you. This country, there's so much partisanship right now. It is unbelievable that a great partisan. I was on a television program recently, and I was debating a supply-side economist, a Republican advisor, and at the station break, in my ear, the producer said, "Be angrier." And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. We're having a respectful conversation. Why should I be angrier? Well, she said, you have got to be angrier because people, they surf through the channels. And they're only going to stop when there is a real slugfest, a kind of a gladiator contest. And so we want you to be angrier. And I said, I really don't want to be angrier. I think that sets a terrible example. And she said, you must be angrier. And at that point, I lost my temper. But I think that one of the problems we have is we're not listening to each other. There's this fierce partisanship. But here's what I had to say. When you have so much of the nation's income and wealth at the top, and this is what I say to people who are very well off, and it's a lesson we learned the 3 decades after the Second World War. You who are very well off would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy that fostered a positive politics than you will do with a larger share of an economy that can't get off the ground because there's not enough aggregate demand, and also that fosters a very angry politics because there's so much frustration and so much anxiety in the population. And we can talk about how to do that. There are many ways of doing that. But it's a point that I think we all need to take quite seriously. Another part of that very uncomfortable conversation that I point out is that Dwight Eisenhower, under whom National Defense Education Act and the National Defense Highway Act. I mean, this country did made enormous investments, and we are still living off the legacy of those investments. The University of Texas and the University of California, where I teach, and other sorts of extraordinary investments from that era. Dwight D. Eisenhower, we rebuilt Europe, we rebuilt Japan. Dwight D. Eisenhower presided over a tax system. Now, this is going to get me terribly, it's going to get me in trouble, and I'm going to hide behind the lectern when I say this. But Dwight Eisenhower, who nobody would consider a radical or a socialist. Dwight Eisenhower presided over an income tax system where the highest marginal tax rate on the top earners was 91%. Now, granted, there were deductions and there were credits. The effective tax rate was below that, but we were in a different world compared to where we are today. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back there. Please, don't let me worry you. I'm not suggesting that. But I do think we've got to be open to different ways of dealing with what I've described. In terms of getting the resources we need to make the investments we have to make. The challenge is going to be huge, and here's what I want to end with. I am very optimistic. I really am. I'm optimistic because I'm a student of American history. And I know that whenever the going gets hard and we understand the nature of a problem, we put ideology aside. We stop calling each other names, and we get on with whatever has to be done. We did it in the first decades of the 20th century when we had to deal with the trusts and democratic machine politics. We rolled up our sleeves and we busted the trusts and we reformed our politics. And then we did it again in the 1930s when we had to deal with an economic calamity that we didn't really understand very well. And we did it again in the 40s in terms of the Second World War, and again in the 50s in terms of Eisenhower's investments. And then we did it again in the 60s in terms of Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and enabling women to have opportunities that they didn't have before, professional women, well-educated women. And on. We have done it on and on and on. When we have to deal with a problem and we understand the nature of the problem, we do not let ideology cloud our judgment. We're very practical, and we're very resilient. And so I am very, very positive about the future. The question is, how long is it going to take us to get to that point? The choice before us is quite simple. It's either reform that broadens and widens the pool of prosperity, of shared prosperity, just as we had in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, or it's a very reactionary politics, nationalism, jingoism, blaming immigrants, blaming the poor, blaming the rich, blaming foreign trade, blaming China. We can get into the blame game. And that blame game is not going to help us because none of those targets are the fundamental source of our problem. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Barbara, you let me invite you up. Yes, you're here
that
already.
was well done.
And you have some questions.
We have some questions we've gotten from the audience. We want to thank you both on behalf of the hosts, and particularly the Brazos Bookstore, for diverting your plane and coming to Texas.
Yes, so many passengers were upset.
That's right. And it's all due, this was the brainchild and the work of Jane Mosier, our manager of the bookstore, and Jane is there on the front row.
Yes, Jane, thank you.
And has worked very hard.
I neglected all the thanks that I should have given, and Jane, you're one of them, and Rice University, and Barbara, and everybody else, and this great institute, the Baker Institute, but I want to get right into my talk as fast as possible.
We're ready, and we want to get right to the questions. Do you have any concrete suggestions, you're asked, for rebuilding the middle class that are really attainable politically?
You had to add that little thing, really attainable. Well, as I said, I think that I have a, could you pass that book, please? I don't want to be crass. Commercially, that is. But it's all here. Now, but politically, the question is, and that's a good one, I do think that it may take us a couple of years, unfortunately, and it may be a very difficult few years, because again, if you followed my logic, unemployment is going to stay way up there, the economy is not going to grow very fast, it's not going to grow fast enough to get unemployment down. We will have a problem on the aggregate demand side for all of the reasons I talked about. So I am not optimistic that the economy is going to get out of the gravitational pull of the Great Recession anytime soon. And we're going to see, unfortunately, some rather angry and perhaps even reactionary politics in terms of a revolt against globalization, against trade. We're already seeing it start, against immigrants. A lot of this is already beginning. But I think, in terms of responding to the questions, it'll take a couple of years before people at all levels, including people at the top, say, wait a minute, this is dangerous, the direction we're going in. And we've therefore have got to embrace reforms. And we've got to get out of this partisan trap we are in.
The next question was specific and wanted to know how much has increasing medical costs dampened wage gains?
It's a good question, and undoubtedly part of that stagnant wage we saw beginning in the late 70s is due to rising medical costs. But what we also saw is that businesses that used to provide, particularly big businesses, small businesses really have always had difficulty providing medical care and medical insurance. Big businesses, as soon as those healthcare costs started to escalate, big businesses began to shift the costs of co-payments, deductibles, and premiums more and more onto employees. So it's very difficult to say that there was a great deal of wage loss because of healthcare and healthcare increases. I mean, this is another, if you really want to leave here depressed, this is another big problem we've got to deal with, is rising healthcare costs. This is really the core of the entitlement problem we face in the next 20 or 30 years, as you've got 77 baby boomers all getting older. I mean, 77 million baby boomer bodies all corroding together. And medical costs going up because medical science is doing such a terrific job, honestly. But you put that together, you have incredible, unbelievable expenses. I mean, part of it is prevention. We could get into this, Barbara. We don't really have time to get into it. But let me just say, my father began walking, prevention. He began walking 5 miles a day when he was 85. He is now 96, and we have no idea where he is.
So we'll pursue medical care perhaps later. You have a very specific question. Actually, you have a lot of questions about blame, and I wanted to at least pull some out because the audience wants to talk blame. What economic recovery measures would you advise? This is more pragmatic than blame. What economic recovery measures would you advise President Obama to pursue if his party loses control of Congress?
Well, I think it seems more and more likely that at least the House of Representatives is going to become under Republican rule, John Boehner and others. I think I lived through the 1994-1995 transition when President Clinton went from both houses of Congress being Democratic to when they became Republican. And the president, that is President Clinton, had to change strategy dramatically. Not only did he have to, what has been called triangulate, that is, leave his party a little bit behind, but he also had to play much more defense, that is, use the veto a great deal. Because when you are suddenly confronted with a party that wants to undo a lot of the things that you've done, you're going to have to use the veto. This is, again, a potential problem. Let me step back from this. Washington is not the place where change begins. Washington is the place where change happens because everybody else in the country is demanding change. Washington is the kind of place where a friend is somebody who stabs you in the front. No, I don't mean that. But we tend to look to Washington for quote unquote leadership. And yes, to some extent, obviously, it's the responsibility of Democratic and Republican leaders to be leaders. But believe me, particularly in eras of partisanship and where there's a lot of public insecurity and anger, it's got to come from all of us. I mean, it's people who are just saying to themselves, we are determined to find solutions and not engage in bickering. It's not easy.
You make us want to run for office, for goodness sake. It's, to continue kind of to follow up on your question, your answer, one questioner asks, it does not do justice to federal policy and regulations in blaming the cause of the Great Recession on Wall Street, to ignore Washington's role in causing the atmosphere in which Wall Street got out of hand. So, who's more to blame, Wall Street or Washington? The questioner wants you to place blame. And percentage-wise, it appears.
Well, there's a, I would say 49.3%. No, it's a chicken and egg problem. I mean, Wall Street got out of control. I mean, Alan Greenspan, bless his heart, is partly responsible. The Fed is partly responsible because the Fed, remember, reduced interest rates to near zero, but did not, at the same time, increase regulation and oversight of banks and all lending agencies. Now, when you make money almost free, in fact, relative to inflation, it was free, you are inviting banks to take as much money as they possibly can, borrow as much money as they possibly can, and then turn around and lend it to anybody who can stand up straight, and many people who could not even stand up straight. And so, yes, it's a regulatory failure as well. I think Alan Greenspan and others had too much faith in the market. But the blame game, I'm frankly tired of the blame game. I just don't think that it is useful, particularly it's not useful at the levels that I'm trying to get all of us to focus on, which is what's really happened underneath the surface of the American economy.
To persist in the blame issue, however, and put you a little bit more on the spot, if a cause of action for a lawsuit legitimately exists for a state to sue Wall Street for harm done to the economy of the state, what is your position on such a lawsuit?
Yeah, sue the bastards.
Okay. I really like these questions and answer period. There's a very specific question about Adam Smith's invisible hand. And it asks, with a preface, Adam Smith's invisible hand can also be referred to as, quote, no risk equals no return. Why is the example of wage earners not having decreased wages adjusted for inflation not an example of, quote, the invisible hand?
Oh, I think that stagnant wages for 30 years is clearly the result of cause and demand, as I've emphasized. I mean, if you have globalization and technology, both creating a kind of less value, making less valuable routine work, then by definition, supply and demand is going to push down the wages. It's going to eliminate a lot of jobs and force a lot of people into the local service sector, where you have so many people going in, so many workers gravitating there because they can't make it any longer in the routine production sector, that supply and demand is going to mean low wages. So it really all is the invisible hand.
The last question from the audience is one which deals with your appearance on the Colbert Show. And I know the audience would like more intimate details of that.
It was the last night, and you can, I don't know how you find it. I guess on the internet you can see it.
The query is
high intellectual content.
And concerning it, the specific question was, how did you keep a straight face? And tell us about Stephen Colbert.
I did not keep a straight face. I was told by the producer of the show, try to keep a straight face, and I could not keep a straight face. We had an interview. He wanted to talk about the book, and he made some just absolutely preposterous statements about the book, about me, about everything I believe in, and I thought it was very funny. I could not maintain a straight face. So I don't urge you, if you have any sense of humor at all, don't try to do a straight interview with Stephen Colbert. Actually, this book tour, if you're interested, maybe you're not interested, it ends tonight. I'm going back to Berkeley and I have a class to teach tomorrow morning. It's not funny. But I was going to say it started 2 weeks ago with Bill Maher. And it ended last night, or it started to end last night with Steve Colbert, and it ends finally here in Houston. But Bill Maher, I don't know how many of you watched the Bill Maher show, but Bill Maher is a comedian, and he, in that particular show I was on, he situated himself between me and a fellow named John Hamm. Now, John Hamm is the star of Mad Men. He plays a 1950s advertising agency fellow who is tortured by the superficiality and the just the angst of the 1950s. But there he was, right? I mean, as close, Barbara, as you are to me. And he, I'd watched him for. I mean, I love this show, and I was starstruck. But not only that, but he is gorgeous. I couldn't keep my eyes off him. For what that's worth.
We greatly appreciate you changing your schedule. I know that Jane angst through the effort to contact you and change your schedule so that you'd come here, and we are most appreciative for you being here for us. And now we're going to get him to his airplane.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, most appreciated. That's great.
Thank you.
And I guess, Jane, we have some opportunity for specific signing in the back. There's going to, right here to the left, until we have to get back to the airport, but we're going to have opportunity for specific signing for personalization of the books.
The plane was diverted, but they did make allowance for book signing.
Good.